Good morning, everybody. You're very welcome. It is 11 months almost exactly to the day that we shut the office in Mason Hayes and Curran and we sent everybody home. And while we're all really looking forward and excited to getting back to the office at some stage relatively soon, hopefully, but maybe not as soon as we'd like, it's becoming very clear to us and to most people around the world that some form of remote working is here to stay. This morning, we're going to have a look at some of the legal and organisational considerations around this new normal as it's being described. The reality is that some form of remote working is probably going to feature in most people's lives in some shape or form. And I'm delighted to be joined this morning by my colleagues, Ronnie, Neville and Orla O'Leary, with whom I am going to chat through some of the legal considerations organisations, people managers, HR practitioners should be thinking about. But I'm also very excited to be also joined by Dr Melrona Kirrane. Melrona is the Associate, thank you for the wave, Melrona. Melrona is the Associate Professor of Organisational Psychology in DCU Business School. I have spoken with her before. I've always found it fascinating. I've always learned something when I have listened to her. And she's going to talk to us about some of the organisational and management issues in dealing with a remote workforce effectively, whether that's permanent or temporary or part-time or full-time. So I'm looking forward to that. But we're going to start first of all with Orla, and we're going to just have a chat initially about some of the main issues employers should be considering or need to be considering around remote working, Orla, because the reality is that it's here to stay.
Thank you and good morning, everyone. Yes, absolutely. The reality is, in some guise or other, remote working is definitely here to stay. I think whilst many people might shudder at the thought of never returning to the office again, similarly, I think the reaction would be similar if we were told you have to come into the office 5 days a week. So not surprisingly, a recent study by NUIG found that 94 participants want to work remotely in some form after the pandemic. Indeed, any of the surveys that you've seen, for the most part, employers and employees are keen to ensure that working remotely, whether that's from home or from a hub, will be part of our future working life, regardless of any public policy mandating it. There are so many benefits to working from home, whether that's employee retention, work-life balance, cost efficiencies, reduced commuting times. And we've seen many of our clients are putting plans in motion at the moment for working from home in the future. So, for example, I'm aware of one employer who's proposing to introduce a core days policy at work, obviously once the restrictions are lifted. So in that case, the employer is going to require all employees to come into work Tuesday and Wednesday. All client meetings, management meetings, training days, etc. will be held on those days, and then it's work from where you wish after that. So against that background, it will come as no major surprise that only last month the government published its first national remote work strategy. And amongst the commitments contained in the strategy is planned legislation giving employees the right to request to work remotely. It's meant to be introduced by September this year. I think it's important to note though that the right at the moment, as we know it, is to request to work remotely and not necessarily the automatic right to work remotely. And they're very different things. We haven't seen any draft legislation, so we don't know what form the legislation or the request is going to take, but the strategy does refer to a type of remote, blended and flexible working arrangement going forward. So the legislation is going to provide a framework against which employees have the legal right to request long-term remote working, but also provide employers with clarity on the best practice with dealing with such requests. So in my mind, it certainly implies, and I think one would hope and nearly have to assume, that the employer will have the right to refuse to request to work remotely where there are objective justifications and objective reasons for such refusals. And recent commentary also indicates that employees may have the right to go to the WRC if they consider that the employer's refusal has been unreasonable. Now, one interesting point, and it isn't something that I'm actually going to be getting into because Ronnie is going to deal with it later, is the issue of remote working in another jurisdiction. It's a very thorny issue for employers at the moment, but it is something that the strategy doesn't currently deal with. So it might be something that the legislation will deal with in time, and only time will tell.
So no doubt it's here to stay, Orla.
Absolutely.
If that's the case, and on the basis that that's the case, would you recommend employers put in place a policy?
Most definitely. A policy is something that we always recommended anyway, you know, where employers were offering this type of flexibility in the pre-COVID and pre-strategy world. So, however, in circumstances where it's obviously going to be a permanent footing and it's getting a statutory footing, it is certainly something that we will be recommending.
And Orla, what should go into the policy? Presumably it should start with how an employee should make a request.
Yes, absolutely. Like, it isn't going to be a one size fits all, because not every industry is going to lend itself to remote working. Construction, hospitality, healthcare, that isn't going to work for a lot of them. But, you know, it will obviously work for certain industries. So the Department of Enterprise, Trade and Employment has actually published a guidance note, and that's probably going to be your first port of call for any policy. But in terms of the form itself, yes, who's going to be eligible to apply? Look, the framework and the legislation is obviously, we're going to be guided by that, and your policy is going to have to comply with that. But where the legislation permits, we would certainly be recommending that you retain as much flexibility as possible regarding when an employee can actually make the request to work from home. Because generally speaking, we would always be saying things like, right, people that are maybe on probation have a formal performance improvement plan issue, certain disciplinary warnings, the role just simply doesn't work remotely, or maybe even the home environment doesn't lend itself to working from home for health and safety reasons, confidentiality reasons. So certainly you need a degree of flexibility there. And separately, I think in relation to the practical part of it, how is it going to work in practice? Are you going to have a trial period? Is there going to be a review date? Can the employee opt out of it and say, look, I no longer want to work at home? Can the employer terminate the arrangement? Also retain the flexibility to, you know, require the employee attend the office on various occasions, maybe for client meetings or training or team meetings. And also the strategy talks about an appeals process. So the employee is going to have the right to appeal a decision if you refuse the request.
And this is something most organisations should be at least somewhat familiar with, because there's a similar right to request part-time working, and that's been in place for a while. What other kind of employment considerations, if you like, should employers be thinking about when putting their minds to a policy and how they're going to approach these requests for remote working? Okay, well, I suppose, yes, your location is going to change, but it also is going to impact on some, but not all, other terms and conditions of employment. So, for example, I think your policy should deal with working time. It's obviously something that's been dealt with in the strategy. So working time, time recording, ensuring people can take their breaks, all that type of terms and conditions is going to remain the same. So managers, again, it's nothing new, but managers should be required to review working time records just to ensure that there is compliance. If there isn't compliance, you need to deal with it very quickly. As I said, it's nothing new, but it is coming to the fore because the strategy document, which was produced last month, said that there is going to be a code of practice developed on the right to disconnect. And that's actually going to be in place by the end of next month, apparently. So this is something that employees will become far more aware of. There will be lots of publicity around it. It's going to be on everybody's radar. So if you don't have sufficient working time records or any mechanism to ensure that your employees are taking breaks, this is obviously going to prove difficult for you if you ever have a claim to defend. Again, I think other policies that are going to remain the same and employees should be made aware of this are things like the bullying and harassment policy. So whether I'm talking to you on Zoom or whether I'm talking to you in the office or emailing you or at the Christmas party, your bullying and harassment policy is going to stay the same. Similarly, you know, performance targets, achievements, all of that is going to stay the same. Other policies, though, that you're going to have to look at, or other documents, will be your contract of employment. That will probably change because now you've got this new working from home arrangement or working remotely. So that's likely going to change. So you're going to have a look at that. And again, some of your policies, like maybe your travel policy, your expenses policy, maybe your lunch allowance and your car allowance policies, all of those might subsequently change on foot of obviously somebody working remotely now. Okay, and Orla, whether somebody is lucky enough to have space at home for a home office, or they're working from the dining room table, or they're, you know, they have a desk shoved in the corner of the bedroom, which lots of people, that's a reality for. Like, there are health and safety considerations around all of this. Talk us through that a little bit.
Absolutely, and this is going to be part of your policy. And interestingly, the HSA has actually provided a helpful guidance from working from home that could be your first protocol when looking at drafting a policy.
Yeah.
But I suppose the main thing to take into account is that our legislation doesn't differentiate between, working in Mason Hayes' office and working in Orla's office in her kitchen, dining room, bedroom, whatever. So the employer still has to conduct a health and safety assessment. So this means that the employer must engage a competent person to carry out the risk assessment in collaboration with the employee. So there is a bit of responsibility in the employee as well. Now, how does that work in practice? Well, the HSA have actually said, look, the competent person rings the employee on Zoom on their mobile phone, and you actually walk around your workspace so that the competent person has this, can virtually assess the workplace, identify any risks and recommend any measures to minimize or even eradicate those risks. As such, your policy is going to have to ensure that there's full cooperation from the employee at all times in terms of facilitating any agent of the company and health and safety assessments, etc. The next thing I think, kind of lending on from that is the issue of insurance. So whose insurance is actually going to cover this arrangement? The prudent employer is definitely going to require, or make sure that their own insurance covers any accident at home. But it's not unforeseeable that somebody's going to trip over a printer cable or, God forbid, fall down the stairs while holding a company laptop. And whose insurance is going to cover that? And likewise, I think it's actually on every employee to notify their own insurers that they are working from home. And on that basis, then maybe like things like what happens in the case of fire or theft for your equipment, if they're using employers' equipment, laptops, all the rest of it, what happens then? So insurance is obviously a big issue on both sides. And similarly, if there is an accident, you obviously have to have some reporting obligations set out in your policy as well. Yeah.
A little bit like making sure an employee who uses their personal car for work has got the employer indemnified on it. Not a million miles away from that. And the other issue that we're seeing lots of conversation and concern about is confidentiality, data privacy.
Absolutely.
Especially when you're dealing with sensitive issues. How are employers going to deal with that?
Absolutely. It's a massive concern for employers to make sure that they're protecting their business, and allowing somebody to work from home, they still need to protect their business in the same way. So their information, clients and customers' information, employee data, etc., huge concern. Employers need to ensure that they have, the facilities to make sure that their electronic communication systems are just as effective and secure as if they were in the office. So, as an employer, you're still going to obviously need to make sure that you have remote access and remote control of an employee's device or equipment at all times, regardless of where they are. So your policy is going to have to deal with that. It's going to have to set out, again, the duty of confidentiality, maybe include some practical tips like, require employees to lock their laptops, ensure they're not, they don't have files lying on the kitchen table, what to do if confidentiality has been breached. You're also going to have to look at your data protection policy and your GDPR policy to make sure that they reflect and take into account the working remotely arrangement.
Any final points on what employers should be considering in relation to this policy?
I suppose not in relation to the policy itself, but in relation to other issues that we've seen employers struggle with or maybe have to deal with. Obviously there's employee engagement and maintaining focus and all of that. But one of the issues that we have actually come across is employers struggling to deal with disciplinary issues. So one of the things that we've seen is, maybe perhaps unsurprisingly or maybe surprisingly, depending on which way you're looking at it, employees being under the influence of drink or drugs at home on Zoom, and how do you actually deal with that? So disciplinaries, appeals, investigations, the right to representation, all of that stuff hasn't changed. So you just need to be a little bit more creative and flexible with how you deal with it. So as I said, we've had a lot of allegations of being drunk on Zoom, and we've advised clients to look, like, if you can get somebody to join the Zoom call at the time, or alternatively, shut down the Zoom call, tell them, Melanie, I'll ring you back in 5 minutes, and then have somebody else join us. So at least that there's a collaboration in terms of the allegation, and it might make your process a little bit easier.
Because you say you can't smell somebody's breath.
No, not over Zoom. Not yet anyway.
Thank you, Orla. Ronnie, I'm going to turn to you next. Sinead. Brilliant. Thank you, Ronnie. Thanks, Orla. Ronnie, because what I want to talk to you about is something that's featured a lot in the media, and it's about employers, and Orla touched on it a little bit earlier on, employers who are trying to manage employees who have gone abroad. And as a team, it's something that we've had to give a lot of advice on, especially over the course of the last 3 or 4 months. People who have, you know, employees who've gone home to, you know, Mammy in Madrid or Brazil or Poland or wherever, even to the UK. Can you give us a flavour of some of the issues that are coming up in that space?
I just wanted to talk more about or hear more about the drunk on Zoom stuff, which is funnier than the type of, you know, the type of international mobility issues. But it is an issue, and it's an issue which got a lot of attention towards the end of last year. It was widely reported that Google, for instance, for legal and tax reasons, were notifying all staff that they had to return to their home jurisdiction. So home as in the country through which they were engaged. And it was reported that up to 30% of Google's Irish 7,000 number staff were said to have left the country. Now, we got a lot of queries coming towards the end of last year from larger clients, particularly multinationals, but also from domestic and smaller clients in respect of employees who had based themselves in other jurisdictions for many months at that stage, like some going back to March and April. A lot of these employers didn't know this initially, and only became aware after some months. Other employers consented to the move to other jurisdictions, albeit with conditions. So it is a major issue. It's a major issue for the employer, but also for the employee. And in the context of this top tip session, my early doors top tip would be that if you know or if you learn that you have staff working outside the jurisdiction, you really should make inquiries with local tax advisors or local lawyers or tax advisors in that jurisdiction, so you can look at and evaluate the level of risk and potential exposure. Some employers now, probably the majority in our experience, have either already required or are currently requiring the return of their employees to Ireland. Now, there could be some reasons why an immediate return is complicated. Some people have health concerns, they're caring for family members, they might have issues with dependents, they might have given up their rented accommodation in Ireland, so they've nowhere to stay. But taking that preliminary advice is crucial, because depending on the country in question, the level of risk, legal risk, tax risk, financial risk may vary.
So Ronnie, you mentioned there legal risks, financial tax risks. We'll touch on some of the financial ones in a second, but will you talk me through some of the legal risks in particular, because these are the ones that we're highlighting to employers who found themselves in a situation where they have many of their employees spread all around the world, actually.
Yeah, sure. So a lot, I'm guessing that many on the call, many on this session, many of the clients will have heard of the Rome Convention, which basically provides that regardless of the governing law and the contract, employees are protected by the mandatory rules of the country where they're habitually carrying out their work. So the mandatory rules are essentially the minimum employment statutory provisions and protections in a country. So where you've got an employer who knows that their employee has moved elsewhere and is working from another jurisdiction, it's not sufficient to simply assume that as long as they're getting the same protections and benefits that they would under Irish law and under their Irish contract, that everything's in order. So these employees should in fact be covered by local law. That includes rest breaks, that includes working time provisions, public holidays, annual leave, for example. Separately, there's a posted workers directive, which is designed to protect employees who are posted, which is basically sent to work temporarily from one EU jurisdiction to another EU jurisdiction. And posted workers are guaranteed the minimum employment law protections in the country of the host state, so where they've gone. It's basically to prevent a race to the bottom type scenario where workers are then sent to work in effectively in cheaper, sent from a cheaper country to work in a more expensive jurisdiction. So again, the employer has to ensure that local laws are followed, which means taking local advice. And there's actually a legal obligation to notify the authorities in a whole state where an employer is posting their workers, and there's possible penalties and fines. Another possible legal complication that arises is corporate governance. So local law in the country where the employees are now working may dictate that the employee's presence and their activities in that state require the employer, the Irish employer, to set up a branch. Now, if we look at it through an Irish lens, there are specific factors that get taken into account to determine whether the work being performed in Ireland by a non-Irish employer requires that employer to set up a branch, and with our company's registration office, CRO. So again, local advice needs to be taken whether the law in the relevant country the employee is based would equally require a branch to be set up. There's lots of legal issues.
And not very simple ones, and one might have some sense of what's going on in Europe. It's completely different if somebody's gone to Brazil or to Australia or to China or to whatever. I should have said we have a Q&A box at the bottom of everybody's screen. I see there's some questions starting to come in, but if there's anything you'd like to ask, we'll come back to the questions at the end. I have one for you though, Ronnie. Are there immigration issues where employees have left the country and gone to work somewhere else? And where does the responsibility for that lie? Is that something you're seeing?
Yeah, big time. And you mentioned it a moment ago that it's less of an issue when it's Europe to Europe, because obviously we've got free movement of workers. It's a different issue where you've got employees working in non-EEA states. So provided they're working in the EEA, you're not going to have issues for Irish nationals, at least with work permits and visas. But bear in mind how incredibly international the Irish workforce has become. We had a really novel query probably a month ago at this stage, where one of our clients has a Chinese national who has their visa, has their Irish work permit, and unbeknownst to the client, that Chinese employee has effectively decamped to the south of France with her French boyfriend since March, April. So, it's not sufficient to assume that because as soon as the employer learns of this, that they've got their Irish work permit, that they've got their Irish visa. Local law will dictate what the visa requirements are for entry into and for residing in the country. Local law will dictate what their own work permit rules are. And again, if you look through it from an Irish lens, it's a criminal offence for an Irish employer to allow their employee to be working in Ireland without the relevant permits. It's likely that there's going to be similar local law requirements, fines, penalties, not just for the employee, for the employer, but also for the employee. The employee could get expelled from that other jurisdiction. So there are a lot of immigration issues that get thrown up, and particularly, as you mentioned, if you're talking about whether it's Irish or non-Irish employees, whether they go outside of Europe, again, that's going to throw up a lot of issues around what visa requirements and work permit issues are required.
And criminal exposure in many countries, including in Ireland, if somebody is working without the right permission to work. So a whole host of legal issues, Ronnie, definitely immigration concerns that have to be thought through as well. And then there are kind of financial issues that organisations have to think about, largely tax related, but and you and I are employment lawyers, and this is always going to need specialist advice, but it's something we have had to deal with. So talk us through kind of at a very high level some of the financial and tax issues in particular.
Yeah, absolutely. And you got my caveat in first for me, because we're always loath to slip into giving tax advice, but at the same time, what we're discussing now are issues which we as the employment team are being asked regularly, and we're pulling our tax colleagues into these conversations where clients have either they permitted it early doors or they're learning later on, and as time goes on, And as we've acknowledged, that spotlight got shone on this issue probably towards the end of last year, where, you know, folks focused on housekeeping, getting people back into the country, because they were looking at not just the legal issues that I talked about, but also the potential tax consequences. So I'm not a tax lawyer. You need to get specialist, either legal or tax specialist advice, but just to look at some of those issues that we've encountered and that our tax team have been telling us. It's not just for the employer, by the way, as well. You know, it can throw up a lot of tax concerns for the employee, which I found interesting for my tax colleagues. Local legal advice just has to be taken early doors. So the first thing that our tax colleagues are advising, or that the clients were most concerned about, was whether or not having staff living in and carrying out their employment activities in another country could give rise to a permanent establishment arising in that jurisdiction. I should point out that the taxation of cross-border workers generally depends on the local law in the country where the individual is based, and whether Ireland has a tax treaty with that other country. So these international tax treaty rules based on an OECD model may be relevant to the tax rules in question. And there was a concern early on in the pandemic that the pandemic was going to affect the normal application of these rules, and the OECD issued a guidance in April of last year. Now, given the passage of time, and because of these particular rules which have grown in relation to interpretation, the OECD published only recently, on the 21st of January last, an updated guidance. And it's those tax concerns which actually cause a lot of those employers to try to bring people home. So the main concern, as I mentioned, was whether or not a permanent establishment might be created. And that's effectively a taxable branch for corporation tax purposes, which is very significant for clients who have paid a lot of money and spent a lot of time in creating their tax structure for their company or for the group. Another issue then is whether the presence of the employee might create a problem for the company and for the employee, that it might create a tax residence for both. It's probably more of an issue for the employee though, because the residence of the entity is generally only affected if the directors of the company are residing in another country. But where the employee is, it could cause a problem for the employee that their tax residence could default to, or be deemed to be the jurisdiction in which they're carrying out their work. A third issue is the tax on income from employment in another country, and people might be familiar with the 183 days test. Now, this updated guidance from the OECD, it's from their Secretariat's view on the interpretation of the provisions of tax treaties, but ultimately it's each tax authority, each individual jurisdiction, it's up to them to devise their own tax guidance. But that said, the guidance offers a lot of clarity to those affected, and it shows the general approach of different jurisdictions across the OECD, and it shows how jurisdictions are effectively taking into account the impact of COVID-19 in these tax situations. So a lot of the concerns, although these concerns, a lot of the concerns have been allayed by this recent updated guidance, which was just issued a couple of weeks ago. Again, the strong message has to be that tax advice, local tax advice, should be taken, because each tax authority can apply different tax rules, and also the interpretation will depend on the particular facts at hand about, you know, the nature of the role being performed, the activities being performed. So again, local advice has to be taken, and bear in mind that, you know, there may not be tax treaties with the particular country in question. So, for instance, Ireland doesn't have tax treaties with South American countries. So again, local advice.
Well, and what then, Ronnie, about social security contributions, PRSI, national insurance, whatever you want to call it?
Yeah,
where should that be paid?
Well, a lot of the clients on the call may be familiar with a social charges directive, which allows workers to be posted in other jurisdictions and to prevent what would otherwise be a swapping and changing between you know, the home country social welfare system and the host country social welfare system. So a temporary posting, temporary being up to 2 years, can allow the employee to stay on the home welfare state jurisdiction, but it's up to the employer to apply for, to fill in and to set up a form A1 that allows the employee to be posted for the 2 years to stay on the home state. So again, there's technical requirements. If you've got someone who's been posted now for the guts of 9-10 months at this stage, there are going to be potential issues around whether they should be defaulting into the host state social welfare system. So again, notification requirements or the filing of this form, because many employers will have kept their employees on their home, Irish social welfare system.
I think that's a good point, because we had the same issue with kind of health and safety, risk assessments of people's home working space, whatever about what employers might get away with, and it's certainly not a way to approach business, but what might get away with for a few weeks or a few months, particularly given the pandemic and the unusual circumstances we all find ourselves in.
Yeah.
We're now in a situation where, like I said earlier, we're at home 11 months this week, 11 months.
Dragging on.
And, and in another month, it'll be a year, and somebody's in a different jurisdiction working. It's a whole different ball game, and it absolutely is something that runs risks and needs to be considered. But a lot of that will mean taking advice in the country where the employee is. And lots of organizations, big and small, are doing that, but some just aren't. What are the kinds of things, Ronnie, that how are employers dealing with this? I mean, you mentioned there the press, the media about Google requiring everybody to come back, but how, what are your tips for employers in trying to deal with these issues? What are you seeing?
Well, towards the end of last year, we saw a lot of clients come to us for advice around how to regularize the position. And again, a lot of those concerns were legal risk issues, tax risks. Maybe that needs to be reevaluated in light of this most recent guidance. But again, I'm not a tax expert. You need to get advice in the country in question. But a lot of clients issued a diktat, and they basically said, anyone who's employed on an Irish contract where your place of work is supposed to be Ireland, they issued this diktat, you need to come back to your normal country of work. And unsurprisingly, as employment lawyers, if we're speaking to HR practitioners, you won't be surprised to hear that the best approach then when you're dealing with this, it in some cases became a thorny issue, was to act reasonably, to give lots of notice, to engage with staff in where those concerns were being raised. And again, trying to distinguish between, and we all know who they are, certainly at the coalface, the clients, the HR practitioners know, those that are really genuine concerns, medical concerns, personal concerns, versus those who simply like, sipping the glass of vino in the south of France or in Portugal, where at far-flung destinations, and earning, Irish wages in jurisdictions where, they might now be on a multiple in real terms of what they would otherwise be earning in those locations. So a lot of clients took the view that unless there were exceptional reasons, those didn't return by a certain date. Some said the 31st of December, some said first day back, 4th of January 2021, that they would be deemed to have resigned. Some clients have decided to expand their operations into those jurisdictions where the employees have based themselves now. Not many, mind you, but some clients already had operations in those jurisdictions, and then effectively offered to convert those contracts, those Irish-based contracts, into local-based contracts. So that was another option to effectively localize it. But for those clients where you don't have an operation, you're concerned about the tax impact, you're concerned about the legal impact, and ultimately you decide, look, I want you to get back to your home country of work, and you were dealing with some really tricky and some novel situations and excuses and reasons why people refuse to come home. So where people are offering medical grounds because they're caring for dependents or elderly relatives or what have you, the employer just has to act reasonably and needs to be flexible and be seen to be flexible. So obviously, we had a huge surge of COVID numbers at Christmas. So trying to get people back for the end of the year, there had to be reasonable and to be flexible in relation to acknowledging that we had that huge spike. Also the travel restrictions, flight restrictions, that also impacts on it. You got to be cognizant, I don't want to overuse the word cognizant, but you got to be mindful of the fact that where medical concerns arise, you've got the same requirements to provide reasonable accommodation in respect of disability issues as arise for local Irish employees. And of course, things are complicated then when you're trying to offer those accommodations and look at what accommodations you can afford where you're dealing with international travel. Ultimately, though, I think the message has to be, I don't want it to seem like, it's all bend, and be flexible in terms of the employee. A lot of clients are savvy enough to know where you've got to flex and bend and where it's time to effectively lay down the law. Ultimately, as long as you're consulting and acting reasonably, the employer is entitled to require their staff to return to the jurisdiction under the contract.
I see some interesting questions there coming in, Ronnie, and we'll come back to them in a few minutes, just about kind of employees working for a Republic of Ireland company based in Northern Ireland, how it impacts them, and kind of whether there's any hard and fast rules about how long you can permit an employee to work in a different jurisdiction. Have a think about that. I'll come back to it in a few minutes, because I want to turn to Melrona. We're going to get a completely different perspective now, hopefully. There you are, Melrona. Good to see you. You're an organisational psychologist, and you and I have spoken before, and there's been lots of talk about wellness, and there's been talk about mental health issues in relation to employees who are remote working. But there's more to it than that, actually. There's more to it from a HR perspective, from an organisational perspective, from a management perspective. What are the main challenges for employers trying to manage a remote workforce?
Yeah, and some of the issues that Ronnie and Orla spoke about are relevant in this space as well, like even from a non-legal perspective. I think in the first instance, I mean, as we know, employee engagement is a huge challenge, and like Gallup do this survey every year. And in terms of employees being engaged, unengaged and disengaged, the proportion of employees who are engaged at the best of times is about 15%. 15%. And so what I mean by engage is, enthusiastic and eager and embedded and, all of that kind of thing. So in a virtual context, you have just so fewer elements at your disposal to engage employees. It's quite easy when people are on campus, so to speak, for them to feel part of the organization and, to, roll in with the structure of the day and the kind of expectations that need to be met, etc., etc. All of that is kind of gone in a virtual context. And so a huge challenge, I think, for HR people, well, for organizations and HR as being the purveyors of cultural messages, let's say, is to extend the culture of the organization into that virtual space so that people feel that they're part of something and continue to feel that they're part of the organization and that they belong, and also that they uphold the organization and represent the organization in any kind of customer facing roles. So there's a huge demand there on HR to enhance their, I guess, communication of what the organization is all about and how vital the employees are to the organization, how meaningful they are as members and representatives of the organization. So like a lot of things, it comes down to communication from HR of those messages in a remote or to their remotely based employees. But there's a couple of other things, it's very easy for employees to feel part of an organization when the environment that they're working in is conducive to that. So again, like when you're on campus or in the office or whatever it is, everything around the employees is set up to encourage that. But as we said earlier, people could have a table shoved in the corner of their bedroom or their kitchen or whatever it is. It's very difficult to replicate a professional environment in a home context. So the absence of those components can make people feel less and less engaged with what's going on in the organization and less part of it. And again, you've got to be, as Ronnie was saying, reasonable with respect to what you ask of employees in terms of how they do their job and where they do the job, simply because people don't have those facilities necessarily. So you have to encourage employees to, in some way, to think of ways in which they can replicate the professional environment. And that could just be put on your professional clothes for the core working hours of the day and change your clothes in the evening, as opposed to, sitting at your laptop with your pajamas on or something like that, And so also another thing might be to emphasize certain hours of the day are for work. But again, you know, people's circumstances are so different. And, you know, lots of people are struggling with children and homeschooling and all the rest. It's very difficult to make a demand as to when people should be working, you know. And that leads me to another issue with respect to work-family conflict. And so obviously this is a huge thing right now. And the boundaries between work and non-work are nearly invisible or highly permeable anyway at the best of times. But there's also employees who don't have family, who are single and have no children. And a lot of the messaging around working from home tends to focus on parents and the difficulties that they are going through, and they are completely legitimate. But other people can feel really left out and isolated and ignored and not part of the kind of discourse with respect to managing the new normal. So we have to think about employees who can feel left out, can feel isolated, can feel that they don't belong. And again, that's where the communication patterns from the organization become really important. And obviously, employees are part of what's going on foot of team meetings and projects that, you know, have to be discussed and monitored and all the rest. But there's got to be social things as well. So like in DCU, for example, in the business school, we have a coffee every Friday morning. From 10:30 to 11, and that's really nice. And there's no business discussed, it's all just chat. And I think what's really important is that there is this opportunity because, you know, for non-serious discourse to be part of the interaction. Now, the other issue is, you know, as you were saying, the drunk employees on Zoom. I think what we have to remember is people are under a huge amount of stress, and that actually could be a signal of somebody failing to cope. So while on one hand we might think it's desperately irresponsible behaviour, it could actually be symptomatic of a struggle that the employees are going through. So obviously HR, like, I'll just finish this point. Obviously HR have to have their antennae up as to employee well-being. Because behaviour like that, any kind of deviant behaviour, could be symptomatic of poor mental health. And obviously that's attracting huge attention in the media. And as a psychologist, it would be very close to my heart as well. Yeah.
And actually, Melona, that's what I wanted to ask you, because you mentioned stress and you mentioned mental health. And I actually texted a friend of mine who's a lawyer 2 or 3 weeks ago, and in the middle of the doldrums that were January, and I am fairly upbeat and positive at the best of times, but I texted her and I said, jeepers, Olivia, if I'm finding this hard, like it must be just
for sure
killing some people. Have you tips, Melrona, for HR practitioners specifically, and for people managers and business managers around trying to help in that mental health space?
Yeah, for sure. And I think, I guess, you know, to start off, people managers are probably not mental health professionals. And so what's really important is not to overstep into a place, into no more than Ronnie was saying about not giving tax advice. You know, by the same token, managers need to be very careful with respect to entering into the whole mental health domain. But nonetheless, there are symptoms to look out for. And in fact, for HR practitioners who are watching, the CIPD website has a fabulous range of resources and kind of protocols and guides to remaining alert to employee mental health issues. And I think that's probably the first thing, to be alert. And the only way in which you're going to really pick up signals is if you are in touch with your employees. So people managers really should have these social events, but also should have one-on-ones, and maybe HR people need to encourage the people managers to have one-on-ones with people on their team in a casual kind of a way. And during those one-on-ones, the people managers are not there to kind of focus on progress at work, but actually how they're doing. And what's actually really effective is if people managers can share how they are doing, you know, so that they make themselves real, they recognize, they acknowledge that, you know, life's not easy for them either, and what they might be doing in order to try and stay on top of their well-being. And it could be like these obvious simple things like taking a break and going for a walk, and, you know, turning off the laptop at a certain time, and you know, these kind of basic things, but if employers are not in touch with employees who are struggling, well then, you know, there's a serious risk to the well-being of the employee and the team and the organization. It all kind of escalates upwards. I think another component is that employers can't, like, staff at home in terms of struggling with things need structure. It really holds us up over the course of our day and contributes to a sense of accomplishment, etc., etc. So a structured event like a learning event of some kind, where there is some kind of definable outcome, makes people feel that they accomplished something, they saw something through from beginning to end, and that makes it feel a bit more robust, as opposed to the kind of ambiguity and the lack of structure that does tend to prevail when you're out of the kind of normal day-to-day, highly defined workday, let's say. But I would also say it's important, you know, where managers do recognize that there is somebody struggling with mental health, that they possibly refer them to the occupational health component of the organization and refer them on to the EAPs that are available. All organizations would be part of an EAP, and they offer fabulous services. So there are lots of resources available, but they're only going to be valuable, I guess, if the people manager has identified that somebody is struggling. There's one other element, actually, I would just say there, Melanie, in relation to people managers, and that is possibly rethinking workload of employees. You know, when people are stressed, they can easily feel overwhelmed by what they would have been perfectly fine with in previous times, let's say. And so possibly rethinking workload, also rethinking their leadership style, and maybe being able to get more comfortable with giving employees more autonomy. And that's, you know, some leaders are going to find that difficult. You know, they may have been more comfortable with knowing that somebody's working because they can see them at their desk in the office. They can't see them, and they need to be able to be comfortable with giving people maybe greater flexibility, greater decision-making latitude, and maybe defining the end product of a project as opposed to every step on the process that has to be completed in order to deliver the project online as well. So leaders need to get a bit more comfortable with a different kind of management style and be able to pivot into that space where they, you know, let their staff know that they're perfectly confident in the staff's capacity to deliver, and let the staff, you know, work through it in a more autonomous manner.
And we're all working remotely full time at the moment, Melrona, because we're being forced to.
Sure,
but
yeah.
In this new world that we're talking about, where it's going to be, well, likely to be a feature of many people's working life now, some in the office, some at home, and a feature of something organizations have to deal with and learn to manage. I presume all of these issues that we're talking about apply whether somebody's at home 24/7, working remotely, 9 to 5, Monday to Friday, 5 days a week, and not coming into the office, or to Orla's point at the very beginning, somebody who is a structured, you have to be in the office Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday, you have to be in the office Tuesday, or whether it's flexible. But all of these issues come up if anybody's doing any element of remote work.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, these are kind of common management practice that HR professionals are completely familiar with and expert at as well. But given that there's this bigger gap to traverse now because the person's not in the office, it does require this extra thought of how much have you actually connected in with your staff, and how much can you be sure that various different individuals are doing okay. So there is this added I suppose, requirement for enhanced levels of engagement with staff, and the extra effort to do it. And it does, it's simple, you know, just putting small little windows in people's diaries to get together. But part of that is to really be checking out, is everybody doing okay? And asking the question, you know, being explicit, how are you doing?
And making the time.
For sure, yeah, for sure. But it doesn't take long. doesn't take long. And I think the thing, you know, when managers can demonstrate that they're actually authentically asking you how you are and really want to know the answer, and that is kind of a central or a continual feature, let's say, of chats once a week, people will open up and people will disclose that, you know, well, this week has been a nightmare. No more than yourself saying to your pal that, you know, I'm really feeling difficult. But so managers have to, you know, have the capacity to create a context, a kind of a safe context for employees to be able to say, actually, this is a nightmare and I'm finding it really difficult. And that's where a manager can recognize, okay, this person needs a bit more support. Am I able to support them more by changing their workload, for example, giving them more autonomy, more flexibility, or is further expert advice required? And at that point, that's probably where the OC Health component would come in.
So Melrona, this is our top tips session.
Yeah.
What are your top tips for HR practitioners and people managers who are trying to manage a full-time or a part-time remote workforce?
Okay, so there are some competencies that have been identified for exactly these challenges. One of which is to acknowledge fears. You know, we don't live in a certain environment, how things are going to work out. You don't really know what's going on in people's lives and their own individual circumstances. Like we all, well, I'm sure a lot of us saw the RT Investigates program on Monday night, and in Tala Hospital, I got the shock of my life. I saw one of a great friend of mine. He was one of the people in Tala Hospital. So you don't know what people are going through. And so it's an enormous competency to be able to say, yeah, this is a scary time, this is a fearful time, and to, you know, acknowledge, I suppose, the human element in the first instance. A few other competencies. One is to ensure that you provide purpose. And what that means is, you know, reminding people of what we're doing, what we're trying to achieve, like in a professional context, what our role is, what our services are, how valuable we are to our clients, what accomplishments we can tick off. Those types of things are, if you like, the hard, definable, verifiable components of why we're doing what we're doing. And it helps to, it translates into people recognizing, okay, I know what I'm doing and I know why I'm here and I know what's valuable and I know what I'm delivering and contributing and all the rest. So you've got the human element of acknowledging fears, or and acknowledge the stress and the demands. But the other side then is, okay, so why are we doing what we're doing, and making that very clear and contributing to persisting with that message. I think a third competency is flexibility. And that is, you know, extends with respect to what you can expect of people when they get their work done, along with how they do their work. So stepping back from the kind of maybe command and control style of people management, which has really seen the back door a long time ago, but even more so stepping into a zone of empowering people, enhancing the amount of autonomy that you give them, and being comfortable with that, and trying to kind of step away from the urgency that you might have felt around, I need to see people and I need to, you know, get my reassurance because I can see them. So being able to live with the ambiguity that involves, and so the competency of flexibility. So accounting for the emotional side, but also the structural side of professional service, and balancing both of those.
We have a huge number of questions, so I'm going to ask Sinead to turn on Ronnie and Orla's cameras. But while Sinead's doing that, Melrona, one of the ones here is for you, and it says, can you touch a little bit on the resources and protocols around mental health issues and engagement between colleagues proactively in a remote environment? I think the second part of the question is interesting. We issue a lot of comms and webinars initiative, but there's no real attendance or interaction. So if an employer is trying, really stretched for time, and it's the thing that falls off the radar, how do you?
And it's funny, I was just saying about the business school coffee on a Friday, and it's the same old crew that turn up, and it does kind of get smaller and smaller, you know. And so yes, there is a sense of, you know, we're doing all of these things, but nobody's actually responding. And I do think that's where the one-on-ones come in. And I think if people are not, you know, attending these types of events, maybe people can feel there's a bit of an overkill, or it's all a little bit forced and it's all, you know, uncomfortable and all the rest. And so if there isn't, I suppose there's an opportunity there for one-on-ones to check in with the employees in a very casual basis. And maybe people also feel, well, I don't want my colleagues seeing my bedroom where I'm doing my work, or might find it a bit invasive and a bit, you know, a bit too personal, overstepping boundaries and all. There is that type of a thing. And so I think, you know, the more you can establish trust with a people manager and have a call with them, that's an opportunity in order to check in. But I suppose, you know, no more than at work, like you don't go to every coffee break or every lunch break or whatever. So you've got to be kind of reasonable with your expectation of how much people will engage with these types of things as well, you know. But the one-on-one, you can't beat that as a technique. But then
is it about leadership as well, though, Melrona? That if, you know,
sure,
if senior people buy into it and spend the time at it, then
oh, for sure,
the importance of it will be underpinned.
Absolutely. You know, culture comes from the top of an organization, cascades down. So whatever is being role modeled by people at the top. And I think people at the top maybe could pop into these very casual meetings that are happening throughout the organization to signal their support for employees, and to signal that hearing from employees and how they're doing is really important to the organization. Yeah, but again, I would, you know, head people, or, you know, suggest people go to the CIPD website. They've great components there, especially with respect to mental health. But I think my big message is you're probably not a mental health specialist. So where you have any kind of concern, there is a protocol with respect to occupational, or drawing on occupational health, and then they're the professionals who would take over.
Yeah, we call that constructive notice. So that once you should have a sense of something, even it becomes a legal obligation then. Ronnie, I'm going to come to you next, because there's a couple of questions about, and I'm not entirely sure we can answer it. There's a couple of questions about how long somebody has to be in another jurisdiction before all of the financial and immigration and legal issues that you touched on become an issue. So is it different if somebody has and a couple of people here have asked about people with summer houses in Spain, I presume most of them, or somebody who's away for a few weeks or a few months. At what point do the issues that we have spoken about become ones that you really, organizations really need to get their hearts and heads around?
Yeah, so I had a quick flick through all those questions, and there's a lot of really interesting ones, and they follow the same general type of theme, or not fact pattern, but the same theme in relation to, is there a time limit? What if it's Brazil? What if it's Northern Ireland? What if it's here? What if it's there? So I go back to, and you know, we do try to get off the fence as a team, and I think we do that quite well in terms of being commercial. But I'm talking to the tax piece a bit, which I'm reluctant to do too much, other than to just give the same themes. But I'm also very comfortable speaking with the legal piece. We all know as lawyers that if we got one of these queries in, from a legal perspective, we can advise our clients that if you've got someone who is working for the summer in Spain or Brazil or wherever, from a European perspective, you're going to be looking at an immediate protection for the mandatory rules if they've been posted there from a legal perspective. So technically, when someone goes from day one, they've got protection for rest breaks issues, holiday entitlements. The reality is that it never or rarely poses a problem, because you know, people are still getting their local, but their home benefits, their Irish benefits, and they go over for sporadic trips. So Ronnie or Mel or Orla or Melrona, if we go over to London for a day or two for a conference or a trip, you know, we don't go back to our employer saying, oh, by the way, there was a public holiday that kicked in the UK and I was there. That just doesn't tend to happen. So from a legal perspective, you've got this bit of push and pull and a bit of commerciality in relation to the fact that legally, some rights apply automatically, but in practice, it works itself out. But the longer you stay over there, you can't ignore someone's legal entitlements if they're there for a full summer. You can't ignore the fact that from a tax perspective, and this is where I'm now sort of overreaching a bit, you need to get the local tax advice as to whether or not in that country, is there a tax treaty which speaks to that time limit? Does the tax treaties speak to the nature of the work that's being carried out that either pushes someone over the threshold for constituting a permanent establishment, constituting a branch, giving rise to income tax liabilities, etc. So there's obviously going to be a difference of approach between OECD countries, between those countries with whom Ireland has a tax treaty, and also depending on the facts pattern. I can sum up though the general questions which ask, what is that magic number from a tax perspective? And I certainly can't give that magic number. And in fact, Mason Hayes, who have a really strong tax department, can't give the answer to what is that magic number, because it'll depend on the country in which the person's carrying out their work, the time frame and the nature of the activities. It's not going to cost a bomb to carry out preliminary, to give an instruction to a local advisor and say, look, there's a budget of £1,000 or £2,000 or £3,000. Give me the basic details around what obligations arise if you have an Irish worker who is carrying out these types of activities. I mean, obviously, if you get more detailed advice, it's going to be more costly, but you should be able to carry out, to seek at least a preliminary overview of the nature of the legal and tax issues arising for those different scenarios. And that's our top tip. And first answer I gave was, this is the top tip, get local advice.
Okay, Orla, one for you. And this is an interesting one. And I think there's probably two parts to it. Are employers obliged to buy office furniture, desks and chairs for people who are working remotely? First part. And then second part is, if somebody ends up working sometime in the office and sometimes at home, is there an obligation to provide 2 sets of equipment?
Interesting. Our legislation actually is not prescriptive as to what equipment is provided to employees, whether like at home. It's a matter for the parties really, but the legislation does require the employer to manage and conduct the workplace in a manner that is, safe and protects the welfare of the employee. So in reality, I've got a Mason Hayes laptop here. Most people have some form of equipment, whether that's table, chairs, whatever, at home from the employer. If you are going to provide equipment, the employer is under a duty to actually ensure that it maintains it and it's installed properly. If the employee is providing the equipment, well, then you need to ensure that it's fit for purpose from an ergonomic and health and safety perspective. The reality is all of that's going to hopefully be washed out in the risk assessment that you conduct in the first place.
And there's another question there, Orla. What if that risk assessment won't result in an employee's home working space being signed off for space constraints or some other reason? Probably different whether you're in a pandemic and a level 5 restriction and whether
exactly then I think maybe you're actually like, I would have thought, well, if you can't sign off on it from a health and safety perspective, it's not going to work from home. Like you just simply can't sign off on it. But then obviously in a pandemic, it's a little bit different. Are you getting into then, are they essential worker? Do they need to return to the office? Obviously you're allowed to go to the office if it's absolutely necessary. So then you're into pandemic type arrangement, which is different. But no, I think for the most part, if an employer or the competent person isn't going to sign off on your kitchen table or whatever it is being health and safety compliant, well then the employer can't conform with its statutory obligations to protect you, and then the request would have to be refused.
We might just have a look at the results of the survey. We're kind of running out of time. Does your organisation plan on facilitating remote working into the future post-COVID? 65% said yes, 2% said no. It's very small. We already offer it. It's something Mason Hayes, it's a policy Mason Hayes rolled out several months before the pandemic. So, and don't know yet, 23%. I think that's quite high. Orla, Ronnie, Melanie, do you think that's high? The organisations just haven't really thought beyond the current full-time enforced remote working.
Surprising.
Yeah.
Yeah. The 65% isn't surprising though.
No.
No, it isn't.
No.
Do you have a remote working policy? Yes, 42%. No, 45%. That figure is going to change. Hopefully.
Hopefully.
Don't know, 12%. Move on, Sinead. Oh, sorry. You know
can
something?
scroll down.
It's me. Sorry. My bad. Sorry. If no to the question above, does your organisation plan on rolling out a remote working policy? Yes, 30%. No, 2%. So that's the same 2% who aren't going to facilitate it and don't know. So that's fairly predictable. Do you have employees working remotely from other jurisdictions? 45% of the people at the webinar.
Wow.
That's huge, huge. 45% is a very definitive no, and some don't know. Yeah, I expect it may be happening where employers don't know it. If yes to the question about what's the biggest challenge with employees working in another jurisdiction, tax, 11%, different employment rights, slightly bigger concern than the tax, 15%. Employees having difficulty, and actually there was a few questions around that about requiring people to travel during the current restrictions, and then people having immigration and visa entry issues, and we've got bans on people coming into the country from certain countries. Obviously that's all incredibly difficult. So that's interesting. And how should HR practitioners and HR and people managers drive engagement with remote workers? So this is your piece, Melrona. Insist on some time in the office. So this is obviously post-COVID. Schedule regular review meetings, have employee supports available, run remote social events. No, people aren't really interested in that. Ramp up communication efforts. That's interesting, 41%, because that's something you talked about quite a lot, that communications piece. Did they look about right to you, or anything surprising in there?
Yeah, no, they look, well, surprised that the social events, I suppose, would be kind of low, because, you know, that would be highlighted as a really important component. And you know what, there's one other thing.
Zoom fatigue, Melrona? Yeah,
maybe, but you've got to be innovative with what you do on the Zoom, I suppose, you know.
Like use a cat.
Yeah, use a cat. Exactly, yeah. But sorry, just before we finish, there's one other thing to think about, and that is staff retention. You know, like we've been talking about people, you know, heading off to the south of France or in their place in Portugal or whatever, the sun shines and the blue sky and all that lovely stuff. You know, HR people have to consider the risk to their talent pool, with people thinking, I'm actually not going back, and actually I'm not going back to that company, and I can find something that suits me better here. So it's really important to retain staff and keep your valuable employees with you. And so that's again where communication comes on board, so that they, you know, remember that they're part of an entity, that they're valuable to that entity, because the last thing you want is the depleted workforce when or you know, a little trickle of people away from you because they don't feel like they're valued, or they don't feel like they are significant, or those types of things. So, you know, keeping the messages going about the company, its purpose, its contribution to the world, those types of things, is how you retain your staff as well.
Really interesting, really interesting. We have a slightly more detailed survey that's going to pop up on the screen in a couple of minutes when we're finished here. We think it'll take about 2 or 3 minutes just to fill out. I think there's about a maximum of about 20 questions on it. Some of that's about this and ideas for our next sessions, but about a dozen or so of the questions are just slightly more detailed, build on the ones that everybody answered at the beginning of this session. And if you take the time to have a look at those, we'd really appreciate it. Other than that, all that remains for me to do is to thank Orla and Ronnie and Melrona. It's always fascinating to share experiences with colleagues and to share some of the things that we're doing, but also to hear from you, Melrona. Like I said, I always learn something when I'm talking to you. So thank you for agreeing to be with us. It's nice to get your take on things. Ronnie and Orla, thank you. And thank you to all of our attendees. Thank you to those who filled out our short survey, and thank you in advance to those who are going to fill out our more advanced survey. Have a nice rest of the day. Take care, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye all.